Thank you very much, Stephanie. Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Mark Funkhauser, and I'm a site manager in the Child Welfare Department with the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges. I am helping facilitate today's presentation with my colleague, Zoe Livingood. Zoe, would you like to please introduce yourself?
Hello, everyone. As Mark said, I'm Zoe Livingood, and I'm going to be filling in for Andrew Wachter today. I am also a site manager for NCJFCJ in the Child Welfare Department.
Thank you, Zoe. The National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges, with support from the State Justice Institute, is hosting a series of 5 webinars titled Opioids in the Courts, Difficult Conversations. This is the 5th and final webinar of the series. The topics for the previous webinars range from prevention, intervention, and treatment, harm reduction, and reducing death and overdose. In today's webinar, we will explore the challenges around supporting recovery in the courts and the community. We would also like to thank our primary funder and partner on this project, the State Justice Institute. SJI has a long history and mission of providing support to improve the quality of justice in state courts, along with fostering innovative and efficient solutions to common issues faced by all courts. Well, we can turn to the next slide, Zoe. So we'll be learning, having some learning objectives today, starting off with understanding the concept of recovery supports as it applies to substance use disorders. We also will look at understanding the role of the courts in the development of an effective continuum of services, including recovery supports. And then lastly, we would like to apply the principles of recovery to juvenile and family court cases. We are talking about recovery in the context of both dependency and delinquency in the court realm and in the community at large and how they connect. We will be highlighting examples that are specific to opioids and broader issues and concerns. We will explore challenges associated with referring children and families to services maybe in dependency and also in delinquency cases and then how courts and other agencies and service providers can work together to meet the needs and improve the lives of children and families. The value of recovery supports in the community cannot be overstated, especially as they relate to the challenges courts face when there is not a significant collaborative network with available alternatives for supporting people from unnecessary deeper involvement in the system, including removal of children, juvenile detention, placement, or other residential services, and for adults in jails and also incarceration and prison. We also must mention the integral connection between recovery supports and the rest of the continuum that we mentioned. Courts, judges, and communities need resources and support as they do not operate in a vacuum or a void. They cannot do it alone. This comes through a serious focus on trust and community relationship building. Getting creative in the development, implementation, and sustainability of services, programs, and resources is all essential. The next slide, Zoe, would highlight for our panel today, our panel discussion today, that we have Zoe and I as facilitators. We have our expert faculty that I'm going to introduce shortly, let them introduce themselves. And then we have the online participants that we're going to bring in on questions throughout the today's webinar. Now I would like to turn it over to our panelists for their short introduction, and we'll start with, on the next slide, Zoe, we'll start with Magistrate Sherry Hartzler from Allen County.
Hi folks, I am a magistrate here in Allen County and I work in a juvenile court, which is a court that, along with dealing with other domestic relations matters, we also deal with child abuse and neglect proceedings and terminations of parental rights. And I've been on the bench since 2015 and have been in private practice for 13 years prior to that. And I currently oversee our problem-solving court, which is called a family recovery court.
Maya?
My name is Maya Gergich. I am a supervisor with the Allen County Department of Child Services. And I saw in the chat that someone asked where Allen County is. We're specifically from Fort Wayne, Indiana. So I have been with the Department of Child Services for 6 years now. When I first started with the department, my role was to investigate reports of child abuse and neglect, and then I moved into long-term case management, and that's what brought me into Family Recovery Court. I've been a part of Family Recovery Court now for 2 years, and I recently moved from a caseworker role into a supervisory role. So I'm super passionate about Family Recovery Court, and I hope that you guys can get something out of it today, because this is definitely a program that has improved our community here in Allen County.
Thank you, Maya. I'm sure that passion will come out today. And Hillary.
Thank you. My name is Hillary Knipstein, and I'm an attorney, child welfare attorney for the Indiana Department of Child Services. I've been with the department for about 2 years. Before that, I was in private practice and was house counsel for a nonprofit that still runs alternative schools for more of the delinquent set. I have cases in both the traditional CHINS track and then our problem-solving court.
Thank you, Hillary. That diversity and experience will come in handy today, so thank you very much. And the next slide, we'll want to set the stage for this webinar. This project emerged from a targeted resource mapping project that Andrew Wachter and I started almost a year ago. We had probably up to 15 courts that we worked with over time, going into their communities and mostly virtually after the pandemic started, and really identifying the various resources that they had in the continuum. We even started with prevention, which sometimes you might think the courts, it's outside the realm of the courts, but it's definitely all connected. And then we developed the full continuum, looking at intervention and treatment, especially harm reduction, medication assisted treatment, and other aspects of the continuum, including harm reduction and reducing overdose and death. And then recovery, we rounded out the continuum with recovery because it's such a critical stage for those who struggle with opioids and other substances, and while they're in treatment, getting recovery, and also as they transition out of treatment and perhaps still in the court system or even out of the court system, and apply those recovery principles to the rest of their lives if they choose to do so. So those 5 components of the continuum were critical to this work that we did. And so we decided to develop 5 webinars that related to each component of that system. And we did this mapping. And once we did that, we developed some action planning around that, discussing gaps and overlaps in the system and how to address those, and also talked about implementing and sustaining those resources for the long run. And as we all know, when COVID hit, it radically altered the landscape of resources in the community. And so they mostly went virtual, and sometimes they were even hard to find. Most recovery meetings went online, and sometimes it was hard to keep those updated. So we did all this mapping almost in the middle of the pandemic. So I want to give kudos to the courts that were involved. It was no small task. So let's move on to the first question of the day. And a little bit of background on that. When we talk about supporting recovery, we talk about treating the whole person. And definitely as a part of that is just addressing underlying trauma. It's hard to do court and treatment work and addiction and recovery work today without addressing trauma. One of the leading experts in the field says it's not about, it's not what is the what are they doing necessarily. It's what is the pain, what is the underlying trauma that is creating the problem. And that's sometimes the substances are just a symptom of the issue. And the collaboration is there's no way around good work in the courts and community without serious collaboration. And it's hard work, but it pays off. It's upfront work that pays off in the end. And that's one of the reasons why we chose to do this project, to utilize the full resource continuum. And then the vital treatment transition to long-term recovery and stability. And then SAMHSA does a lot of work around the principles of recovery, the many paths to recovery, and all of the various aspects of that. And four of the big areas that we look at is health, holistic health, not just mental health. It's physical health and maybe even spiritual health if that people choose to go down that path. And or home, do they have housing? Housing first is a good philosophy. And what is the purpose? What is their meaning and purpose, and how does the community support them? So we want to turn our first question over to Magistrate Hartzler, and we're going to ask all three panelists this question: is what is your role in ensuring adequate recovery resources and their availability in the court and in the community?
So judges have a duty to, I call it, step off the bench and address the needs of the community that you see coming in before you. And so we all know, about the opioid epidemic. And, I guess in Allen County, I would say that started in its worst probably around 2012. And so when I got on the bench in 2015, it was like walking into a war zone. I had been away from the child welfare system for about 5 years at that point. And so everything had changed. And it felt like I was a conveyor belt for terminations of parental rights. We were having kids come home and find a parent dead in the living room from an overdose after getting off the bus. And it was just horrifying to watch. And so that duty to step off the bench and do something different is why I started what's called a problem-solving court, which we call here in Allen County, Indiana, Family Recovery Court. A problem-solving court is a specialized docket, and it is an actual construction of a team, evidence-based practices, compliance with problem-solving court rules, and you have to be certified by the Supreme Court. In our particular problem-solving court, we serve parents whose abuse of substances is most central to the reason why their children have been adjudicated what we call in need of services. And that's Indiana's acronym, if you hear it here today, is CHINS. I think I looked at California. Your acronym is having a child declared to be a dependent of the court. So if you hear CHINS, that's what I'm talking about. And then to be eligible to be admitted to our Family Recovery Court, you have to have certain mandatory factors and then 2 of 5 other eligibility factors. And we try to focus on serving those most in need, those folks that have a co-occurring mental health issue, homelessness, history of being exposed or victimized by domestic violence, lack of healthy supports. And so those eligibility criteria ensure us that we're serving those that are most at need. Our problem-solving court has 3 phases. The first phase is focusing on detoxification and reaching certain sobriety milestones. And as you can imagine, how long someone stays in that phase really depends on the person. You can't put a time frame on it. Number 2, the second phase is education, employment, and then assisting people with relapse prevention. Then the third phase is dealing with, like Mark pointed out, those holistic issues, housing, employment, community resources. And the third phase, you would have to, if your child has been removed, would have to be in your home for 90 days before you could graduate. And each phase has a list of components. In general, there's completing assessments, complying with recovery plans, physical examinations, getting your blood pressure taken. A lot of these folks haven't even seen a doctor for years. And obtaining a sponsor and obtaining other informal supports, because once we're out of their lives, they're going to have to continue to support their recovery with what supports they have in the community. Graduation occurs after they've completed all phases, and as I indicated, has had their children in their care for at least 90 days. That's not to say that every child is removed from a parent that's in Family Recovery Court, because we are so intensive and they come to court every week and there's a lot of monitoring. There are situations where we feel safe leaving the children at home rather than removing them because we have this intensive monitoring. To encourage compliance, we use things like incentives. This could be court cash. They can cash out for things like diapers or personal care items, verbal praise, and way to address when they may stumble in the program. We have things that we call sanctions. Sanctions can be a verbal admonishment, and at its most severe can be a finding of contempt and potential incarceration, which we found we don't do that as much, but that's, I suppose, the more severe end of the sanction list. More often than not, what we do are therapeutic adjustments, and we adjust someone's recovery, increase their meetings, have them do new assessments. And so in summary, that's what a judge's role can be in formalizing these processes and in your community, creating a problem-solving court to serve those folks that come before you.
Thank you very much. Maya, in your role as a family recovery court supervisor, could you expand on your role as it relates to the court and the community and recovery supports?
Sure. Our role is really integral. We are the people that our participants, our parents come to with their questions. We are the people that are connecting them to the appropriate service providers. We're the ones making the referrals for the parents to be assessed so that we know what recommendations or what to follow through with to assist them. All of our parents have one thing in common, and that's a substance abuse disorder, but they also have their own separate traumas that they've been through. So as far as what DCS does on our end is we make sure that we connect them to the appropriate providers. We answer their questions. We're really building a trust-based relationship with our participants because we're in communication with them so much. And so they feel at ease talking to us, letting us know what they need, what their struggles are. Some of the other things that have increased with the pandemic is we've gone to virtual NA meetings for our participants. Those are resources that we've provided them to keep them on track. We're often connecting them with recovery coaches who are coming up with recovery plans with them, who are revising those recovery plans very often, just depending on the individual needs of the participant. One thing that's really important and what we try to build from day one with our participants is they're going to have formal supports, obviously, through the department, through the court, through the service providers. But one thing that we really try to build with them is creating informal supports for them, identifying those informal supports, and because that's gonna ensure their long-lasting sobriety once they're out of the court system, once they're out of DCS. So we just start from day one. We start building, identifying, talking about barriers.
Thank you very much. You mentioned generational trauma and the connection and support. I like the part about not creating dependency. The long-term goal is to actually create independency, and then the recovery coach aspect. I'd like to get into that more as we go through today. So, Hillary, what's your take on the in your role in recovery and in the court and community?
Well, not so much me, but my clients, I think, in the court build demand for these services, the substance abuse services. My community is doing so much, and the folks in our program have what I consider to be the best of what's available. And even we know a gal on the inside, we have all the connections, and it's still kind of a struggle. My clients have to be assertive to the point of like almost aggression to get our folks into an appropriate treatment. So I think building demand and helping to go through all the red hoops, all the red tape and all the hoops to actually get into that programming, and then also creating incentives for the folks that are before our court to engage in those services. We also do a lot of work to connect with what's available, the available resources, and kind of help to put together like a really cohesive plan, I think. So that would be like my take on my role specifically with ensuring resources are available. I don't think we're quite there yet, but we're working as hard as we can.
Yeah. One of the things I heard you say was you're fighting for their process, you know, and getting them what they need, and that advocacy can, you know, a lot of times people don't really have the resources or even the skills sometimes to navigate the system. Even if the system is working well, sometimes it's difficult. So what you said about, you know, developing and then connecting, and I've heard that theme across all three of you, is being able to utilize that full continuum of services, and that's critical to this project and the webinar today. So we're going to move on to a participant question, and we're going to open it up. We'd like for you to, the participants in the webinar here, to put your answers to this question in the chat. Also, if you have any questions throughout the webinar, please put them in the chat. We'll do our best to have the panelists or someone follow up with a direct response, or even a follow-up at the end if we don't have the answers. But as far as participants, are you using any strategies or approaches in your court and community to support recovery? And one of the things that we want to make a note of here is that we've talked about the problem-solving court today, and the development of that. We were chatting before the webinar about how that evolved from you know, the early process, and so you don't necessarily need a problem-solving court to integrate recovery into the process, but that's the way it evolved for the folks here on the webinar today. But we also want to talk about people that work in situations where they don't have organized problem-solving courts. Transportation to the court is a challenge for some, yes. How that can be overcome, I think that would probably depend too between the rural and the urban areas. Could you speak to the transportation? Yeah, Maya says we provide bus passes, gas cards, and access. We're and Catherine Kornblum-Zell says we are part of several collaborations working on supporting recovery. Specifically, we provide access for a parent to spend time. So, so there are ways to work with those barriers. A question here from lots of questions coming in, so I'm having trouble keeping track of those. The question from Jana Mitchell, says, how do you address motivation in the parents to move through these programs? That's a good question, Jenna. And then do you wait until an amount of motivation is expressed from them to undergo treatment and change, or do you try to actively increase motivation in parents to enter the court treatment? Magistrate Hartzler, would you like to address that? Motivation is key.
There's, the way I look at it, there's intrinsic motivation and there's extrinsic motivation. And intrinsic motivation is lasting. That means that somebody has found their self-worth, has realized their value, has come to terms with it, whatever issues they may be experiencing. And that takes a while. That takes a good amount of time to get somebody to trust you. And so phase one, a lot of it is getting someone to understand that, you know, when you come to court and you have a relapse, we're not going to jump all over you. You're not going to jail. We're not going to yell at you. We're here to support you. And there's a lot of trust building that happens to get people to the point where they intrinsically are motivated. That's the difference, I think, with a problem-solving court versus a regular docket. I'm not telling somebody, go out and do this because you have to and it's a court order. I'm trying to inspire them through their trust with us to feel motivated on their own to do it. So, and I'm trying to look at the rest of the question. Do you have to wait until amount of time? So we get them involved in services right from the get-go, because that's part of the process, and getting them to have this intrinsic motivation as well, is to have them to have access to therapists and other supportive services.
Yep. So there's a question in the chat about the balance in incarceration and punishment versus treatment, and we're going to be addressing that in the next question. So I want to move on to that next question now, Zoe, and then for child welfare cases where the children have been removed, does the involvement with the Family Recovery Court extend the foster care timeline past the 12 to 15? So we're getting quite a few questions in the chat. We're going to try to keep up with those or come back to them. So Zoe, I would like for you to run through this slide now, and I'll monitor this chat, and we'll try to come back to these at the end.
Great, thanks, Mark. As Judge Hartzler said, relapse is a part of recovery, even though it seems kind of like the antithesis to recovery. It is part of that process. So as anyone knows, in a problem-solving court like this, recovery for everyone is not a linear process. It's not like you come into the court, you have your case, everything's fine and dandy, and then you're finished. There can be some back and forth, there can be some relapse as a part of this, there can be other snags in the case plan and things as they go. So being able to be supportive, like Judge Hartzler has said, and be flexible and responsive to things like relapse is very helpful for participants. Relapse itself is kind of also a process as well. Relapse doesn't usually come out of nowhere. There are events that can lead up to relapse. There can be that the losing of some of that extrinsic or intrinsic motivation, and there can be other things that can show you that a participant is leading to a relapse. So a big part of this is planning for that relapse prevention and planning for that relapse. So understanding what people's triggers are, understanding what risky people that person has, those places and those situations that it may not be good to be in. So being able to kind of take the scary part of relapse and then be able to prevent it and to plan for it can be really helpful. And it can also help, I like the word trust building that Judge Hartzler used as well. So as a part of this, it's really important, instead of being just on someone's case, so saying someone relapsed and returned to use, they're going straight to jail, they're going straight to another consequence. Being able to be more therapeutic can definitely be more helpful in that process. So in that vein, the next question, which I'm going to volley to Maya first, is how can courts address relapse in a therapeutic way instead of punitively?
Well, first, I'd like to say that language is really, really important to our participants. When they come into court and they have relapsed, our judge often lets them know that this is a place of comebacks, this is a place of redemption. Our judge lets them know, thank you for coming, even though you relapsed, you still showed up to court, and that's half the battle. So I feel like that's very therapeutic, the language that she uses with our participants. And as far as other therapeutic ways that we assist them is, sometimes there will be a therapeutic adjustment of, being assessed to be in a halfway house or being assessed to go inpatient for 30 days. And we're often met with resistance the minute that's mentioned, which is understandable. But the way that the court has approached it is, we want to make sure you're safe. This isn't a punishment. We want to make sure you're safe. What is your long-term goal? Is your long-term goal sobriety? Is your long-term goal getting your children back? And how can we accomplish that? And we have been met with resistance as far as people going inpatient or to halfway houses. But we have never, ever had one participant come out of a 30-day inpatient and say, I regretted going. Never. They're always coming into court refreshed. They're proud of themselves. So from a therapeutic standpoint, that's what we use. And obviously we do have sanctions. The judge doesn't like to use those. We don't throw jail around. That is our very, very last resort. And again, we just let our participants know that we care about your safety. We want you alive. We want you to be there for your kids. So it's making sure you use the appropriate language and how the appropriate tone and how your participants are going to receive it so that you can get them into compliance. And then obviously talk about barriers. Well, why don't you want to go inpatient? Why don't you excuse me, my voice is a little hoarse today. Why don't you want to go inpatient? What barriers are you having? How can we assist you with those barriers? We pull in the service providers, the recovery coaches. Another integral part of recovery is 12-step meetings. So that's another therapeutic adjustment that our judge uses. Is our folks that are really struggling, she'll ask them to do 7 meetings in 7 days. 12-step meetings go on from morning to night. And we try to impress that upon our parents so that when they're no longer a part of this court or no longer a part of DCS, they've built another support system through the people that they've met at these meetings, through the sponsors that they've gotten through these meetings.
All right, Hillary, how would you answer that question?
So for me, and for when we approach relapse, for when I think of relapse as someone who's been in our program or has had a CHINS case and is doing well, and then like stops doing well mid-case. And I think it's really, really difficult to make removing a child from your care not feel punitive. So finding any way that we can to keep the child in home and support that is, I think, our best tool for addressing relapse in a way that doesn't feel punitive. So that's the first thing I would say. And then if the removal does have to happen, framing it as this is, a temporary sacrifice that I'm asking you to make, not I'm punishing you by taking your child away. You have to earn your child, time with your child. I think the other thing is responding with support, like additional support. And I think to echo what Maya said, I guess the vibe in problem-solving court is very different, where you come in like, this is redeemable, we can fix this. Please put down the shovel, like stop digging immediately. But we can work together to get past this. And one thing I think that I will point out over and over is that our caseworkers in CHINS court and in regular track, the ones that I've seen are like the most successful they lead from the relationship and not from a position of authority. So the relationship between caseworker and participant isn't the caseworker standing over them like, you have to do this, or I'm noting for the judge, but it's a relationship where everyone feels valued and they, hey, I respect you and I want to do well for you. I trust your judgment. And so those would be my big contributions for addressing relapse.
Judge Hartzler, would you add anything to that?
Yeah, I make sure that I focus on, when I'm addressing a relapse, proximal and distal goals. And so what is somebody able to control at the stage that they're at? And so they come into court in phase 1, they're in the program for a couple of weeks and they're testing positive for something. I'm going to treat that different in phase 1 than I probably would in phase 3, because it's more of a distant goal at that point to be testing negative when you are in the grips of active use. And so I try to remember where people are when I'm addressing what needs to happen for them. So if somebody's, for instance, in phase 3 and they relapse, well, then we have different conversations with them about, okay, are you using your tools? Are you hanging out with your ex-boyfriend who was your dealer? Tell me about what's going on in your life. We use the term, I think it comes from maybe AA, HALT, hungry, angry, lonely, tired. What was going on with you at that moment where you had that relapse? And so the point I'm trying to make is you have to meet people where they're at to know what they need.
Great, definitely. Yeah, I really liked, yes, actually being able to meet people where they're at versus just saying that you're doing that. I think that really ties into what Hillary said about just because a court officer doesn't mean for something to be punitive doesn't mean it isn't seen that way. So being able to build that relationship and build that rapport, and then to be able to have that trust building, I think is so important as a part of that. So now we're going to turn it over to another audience question. And we're going to ask, how are you and your community addressing relapse in a therapeutic way instead of punitively? So one example of this could be maybe having a participant's treatment provider in hearings, being able to answer some questions about how their treatment's going, being able to have that unbiased scientific, but also that relational approach of knowing where the case is and how that person is doing and having that knowledge.
Yeah. While we're waiting for the chat, the three different questions came up in the previous one. So I'd like to throw one of these out there. The removal of children and how that affects the timeline and the extension perhaps of the 12 to 15 months on the timeline. Magistrate Hartzler, could you speak to how the recovery court handles the timeline and in relation to removal and any extensions and things like that? Could you talk about that?
Yeah. Believe what we've experienced since we started Family Recovery Court is, and this may be in the recovery community known wide, that it takes maybe 18 to 24 months sometimes for somebody to reach sustainable recovery, and which is in conflict with, you know, the 12 to 15 months rule that we have within child abuse and neglect proceedings. And so in Family Recovery Court, we don't enter plans for anything other than reunification. We don't talk about termination. The only time termination becomes a factor is when somebody's terminated from the program, if that makes sense. Because it takes longer than a year, a lot of times, for somebody to reach sustainable recovery.
Thank you. Zoe, do you have any anything else from the chat, or would you like me to?
There are a couple.
Okay.
So one from Catherine Kornblum-Zell is, so they address relapse in a therapeutic way through their drug court and their CHIN's drug court. Amanda Swindle said, we can work collaboratively with the parent and treatment provider to establish a plan if relapse does occur. So it's great to see that relapse planning. Jessica Baston said, facilitating shared planning meetings with the parents and team to collaboratively plan to address the relapse and ongoing treatment and create a relapse prevention plan and or safety plan within the home. And then Jana Mitchell said that she'd love to know more about how Eastern Washington's Baby Court program is facilitated. And I think an important through line of those comments is collaborative relapse prevention. It seems to be a great way to address relapse therapeutically instead of punitively.
Yeah, loving that collaboration there between participants. That's why we're here today.
We did get another question in the chat.
Go ahead, Zoe.
Okay, so Martha Raymond wants to know, so if you don't speak about TPRs, does that mean you use the ASFA exceptions to TPR for removal cases?
Yes.
All right, and so far, right, Mark, that's it. If you want to go ahead
and earlier, you can go ahead and go to the next slide, but I wanted to highlight someone earlier talked about how in Maryland they found that incarceration as sanctions were not helpful with getting parents engaged in treatment. And then there was somebody that mentioned teaming in Kentucky and also some 0 to 3 or exposed infants, some early baby court project. And we have another question about a wellness court in Alaska and the tribal connection. I want to come back to that. I want to leave some time for that here shortly. So I want to move into current strategies now to ensure recovery supports. And when you think about strategies, it's really very targeted. But even the resource project that we identified, you know, certain targeted certain resources in the community and where they were. And one of the things that we talk about is reducing stigma because the language around addiction and people in recovery, as opposed to some of the pejorative language that we used to hear, and the derogatory language, and some of the just the negative focus on addiction in general. So reducing that stigma that's associated with addiction as a brain disorder, instead of some moral issue, and changing that perception in the community is huge to get the community support behind that. And then the barriers, we talked a little bit about that earlier, but we can't really talk about barriers too much, I don't think, because these kinds of disruptions in getting people services, whether it be transportation or um, treatment access or waiting for beds and things like that, definitely slow people down, and then they tend to relapse at times or can't get where they need to go. And then the education and the relationship and the collaboration is an ongoing thread here. And then training in the community. Also, peer recovery training is a growing field around the nation. It has become a professional field that is developing, that people in recovery can be trained and certified and be paid to support and help other people in recovery. And that was mentioned by our panelist earlier in this webinar. And then increased funding and access. I just was following the thread that the legislature in Indiana was thinking about, pulling some money from the mental health services and addiction, and through some advocacy that was restored. So I just saw that in the media today. So we want to focus now on what are your current strategies to ensure, and maybe you've already talked about some of these things, and for individuals and families, and what other things that you haven't talked about already do you do to help people? And not only what you do in the problem solving court, but maybe things that might help some of the participants that don't have the problem solving court. So we'll start with Magistrate Hartzler.
Within the problem solving court, and I didn't talk about this when I was describing what the problem solving court is, but one of the key components is the team. And we have established a very tight-knit, very close team of 3 providers. And we have staffings every week. And so we have an hour-long staffing, hour and a half long staffing before we even start family recovery court every week. And so the strategy is to get treatment, the court, the Department of Child Services, recovery coaches all around the table to talk about how someone's doing in terms of their recovery. And we come up with strategies to either address somebody's relapse or to address other issues that may come up in terms of their progress through the program. Outside of an actual problem-solving court case, the Department of Child Services has a lot of providers that they're contracted with that they can refer families to receive services. One of the best strategies that I've seen when we're talking about long-term recovery is ensuring that people have access to these community resources even when they're not involved with the court. So ensuring that people are connected with peer recovery coaches, with a sponsor, with 12-step meetings to ensure, again, once we're out of their lives, that they can still have access to services.
Thank you very much. We'll go to Maya next on this. Anything that you would like to add regarding strategies and things that we haven't talked about already?
Sure. I think another important part of our clients' long-standing success and sobriety is, Magistrate Hartzler kind of touched on it. We've identified 2 providers in our community to assist us with the Family Recovery Court program. And those providers are the ones that we send our clients to, and they provide us with weekly progress reports on our participants, whereas families that are not in Family Recovery Court, we receive their progress notes on a monthly basis. So there's a lot of accountability. On a weekly basis, we know what our participants have or have not done. So that's really important when we're trying to address things like relapse. We're not waiting months to address relapse. It's being addressed that week. And that's what helps with the sanctions or the therapeutic adjustments or the incentives, the fact that we know what's going on with our people on a weekly basis. And then not only that, some of our folks that are struggling, they're court-ordered to check in with us on a daily basis. So they text us, they call us, they talk about what's stressing them out. We give them resources. So it's constant collaboration. It's constant communication that's made this program successful. And not only that, I know we've talked about the recovery coaches. They've also been amazing in this whole process. They sit down with our participants. They come up with these recovery plans. They talk about triggers, what they can do when a certain trigger arises. And then those recovery plans are constantly revised as our participants are growing, their brains are being rewired, they're handling situations differently. So then they come up with new recovery plans. And then in those recovery plans, they also identify a handful of people they can call. If your caseworker doesn't answer, who are you going to call? If your sponsor doesn't answer, who are you going to call? So we're just really emphasizing collaboration with your formal supports, but also creating those informal supports. And then obviously making sure that we are referring these people to the right services and not wasting their time or the service providers' time. And that's what helps when these two specific service providers join our weekly staffings.
Thank you, Maya. Hillary, what can you add to this conversation about strategies? And
I think this is a nuanced point, but when you think about all of the folks that we work with and how they got to the point, a lot of times the run-in with the child welfare system is considered kind of a rock bottom. So in getting there, we live in a small community, so it's not like Chicago or a big area where people move in and out and there's a lot of transition. All likelihood is you've grown up here. If you've been, running around with a hard crowd for a long time, if your family is having to take care of your children because they've been removed from you, there's been probably some really important and big ruptures in those relationships that are important to you. Like if someone who's not addicted, like who you would go to if you have a problem. A lot of times, the past behavior and they're changing, but I think it's really hard to look past that in 90 days or 120 days. So one thing that I think is really important that we do, and I think it's kind of an inexpensive way that a lot of programs could work, is to find like informal or like we call them pro-socials, but like pushing them to establish relationships or to not necessarily even in the recovery community, but just to be around people, meet new people. It's easy to be in recovery when everyone around you is in recovery and doing the same thing. It's a little bit harder when you're out on your own and still kind of having some rocky relationships with your family or your old friends. And the folks that are always wanting to hang out are the old drinking buddies, the old drug buddies. And so we can't replace those people with really high quality people that will like ensure sobriety. We'll almost certainly see them again. So that's something that's super important to me and to our program. And then the other thing that's really, really cool is that we have folks that have been through our program and they've succeeded, and now they come back sometimes. And so people who have very much been there are willing to come back and offer support and kind of be an approachable peer mentor to the people that are coming behind them. And so that's kind of interesting to see that dynamic. It's not always the folks who you would expect would end up being the role models. So things change pretty fast in Jen's world, but it's kind of cool to see.
yes, thank you so much for mentioning that. One of the things that I heard was the generational cycles, and you mentioned that you're in sort of maybe a smaller or mid-sized community, and then you have larger metropolitan areas, and then there are also really small rural communities that still struggle with these kind of things. So there's no discrimination there with regard to addiction and substance use. The pro-social, that's probably one of the hardest things for people in recovery to do. They say change the people, places, and things. And that is hard for people to just when you say, hey, just don't hang around them. But and you also mentioned the that support in and outside of the recovery community. I think that's very important because people have to find a new way of life, and that does include new interests and new hobbies, and they sort of reinvent themselves in the long run and really become entirely different people in some ways. And so they developed, and then they find new maybe outdoor activities, or getting into new hobbies or sports and things like that. So it's interesting to watch people unfold as they learn these new things. So let's move to the next participant question, and I do want to revisit some things in the chat while we're waiting. What strategies, those of you in the audience, are you using to in your community to ensure individuals and families have support? We have about 8 minutes left, and while we wait on the chat, I want to address a couple of things in the chat. One is if a child is not removed, Maurice Portley says, if a child is not removed, can the recovery court be considered a prevention court program under Family First? And I think there is a clearinghouse for Family First, and any certified, I'm not an expert on the Family First, but any particular program, treatment program or other program that is certified and run through that clearinghouse can be utilized through Family First. Now, do you all use Family First at all, Magistrate Hartzler, with regard to this program? I know it's some states are having trouble accessing certain funds and things like that, but are you using Family First in the context of the recovery court at all? Are you
Our
familiar with that?
providers, yeah, our providers
Yeah.
in the Family Recovery Court are, I don't believe, and Maya, you can nod your head if I'm right, I don't believe they're Family Pres providers, are they? No, they're not.
Correct. Yeah, they're not.
Yep. And that might involve some kind of for reimbursement and things like that. So,
Yeah.
but I would refer people to the Family First website or the clearinghouse for that. And then the other thing that has come up on the questions is that says we employ certified peer recovery specialists. The challenge, this is from Nadira Salim. The challenge with that is the majority of peer recovery folks can't pass the background screening requirements established by the state. And that is an issue. Have you run into that? Any of you three on the panelists here run into the background requirements to hire certified peer recovery specialists? Any obstacles there?
So our recovery specialists are hired by the agency.
Yep.
So for example, we use an agency called Phoenix and Associates, and they hire their own recovery specialists. So as far as the background goes on that, there's no issue. But then also a part of our program, a part of what our clients have to complete in the phases is they have to get their own sponsor, and then they have to identify an informal support person who is a sober support. So really they have 3 people that they can fall back on for help or assistance or to reach out to if they're struggling.
Yeah. So, and is anybody else going to want to respond to that? I can respond to it to some degree. I've done some training with certified peer recovery specialists, and it is an issue that oftentimes when people have been incarcerated and have a misdemeanor or a felony on their background, there is a bit of a quagmire there sometimes. There are a lot of state nonprofit and state training organizations funding that train these certified peer recovery specialists, and they can actually, if they can get certified in the state, then chances are they've jumped through some of those hoops. But with regard to the screening requirements, that would be an advocacy issue through the state legislature. To say that, hey, we want these people to, even though they've had a background, they've made the changes, they've been rehabilitated, even though they do have a felony, sometimes that might make them even better at what they do. And there's even some forensic peer specialist training that people that actually have been incarcerated can go back in and work with people in the system. but that you're right. There are some issues with that. I want to address one more thing before we leave. Is that they ask? There was a question about the wellness court in Alaska and the tribal. Are you all doing any work with the tribal community in Allen County, or do you know if there's a designated tribe in your region? Are you working with ICWA or anything like that?
We will have ICWA cases from time to time, and the tribe in Allen County, Indiana is the Miami tribe, and they're not a federally recognized tribe, because I think that's when ICWA comes into play. I can say that I deal with it very infrequently, so we don't have a tribal court, if that's the question.
Okay, all right. Thank you. I know you have a refugee population also that, and that poses some challenges sometimes. So you've been dealing with that. The other question in the chat that we did not address is that can the program apply for waivers through the state? I'm not sure what that means, but I'm not familiar with that, with what that really means. So if you want to put that in the chat, but what I want to do now is turn it over to Zoe. We've got about 3 minutes left, and we do have some resources that we want to pass along. And I think Stephanie or somebody's going to put those in the chat. Zoe, would you like to go through some of that for us, please?
Yes. So as we get to the end of this, do any of the panelists want to take about 30 seconds for final thoughts? Anything you haven't said that you'd like to say?
I would encourage anybody, if they're thinking about it, and if you've got a supportive judge, or if you're a judge and this is your passion, to look into problem-solving courts. If you weren't a believer the first day, you left court a believer. It's been one of the privileges of my career to be a part of this, and so I would encourage anybody to take that step.
And if I could just add something real quick, some of the participants that have joined our family recovery court had previous involvement with the department. They had cases that lasted up to 36 months, went to TPR, and then they've come back and either they've had additional children or something happened, and now they're in family recovery court. And those participants have come back and they've succeeded, they've completed the program, they've shown up to court to provide support to our new people and to let them know that on the regular CHINS track, they didn't have this much support, they didn't have long-lasting success or sobriety without the family recovery court program. And so that's been really profound for us, for our team, to see that come full circle.
Alrighty. Stephanie has dropped in some of the additional reading in the chat, so make sure you see that. And she has also dropped in the link to the webinar evaluation for today. So if you wouldn't mind taking just a couple minutes to fill that out, that would really help us. Also, a lot of this stuff that we're talking about is going to eventually live on its own website. So I'm sure that that will be sent out via our NCJFCJ listserv as well. So Mark, I don't know if you want to speak any more on that, but I know that that is coming.
Yeah, we're out of time. So I just want to really thank everybody for showing up today. Some of you have been faithful participants throughout almost all 5 webinars. So we really appreciate the support. We appreciate the bonding through the participant community here. And that's what it's all about, is building resources. And we want to thank our panelists today and staff for this webinar. So thank you all very much and have a great day.